Jeremy Deller's 2019 film Everybody in the Place chronicles the rise of acid house, attempting to place it within the context of a rapidly changing Britain. Helmed by Margaret Thatcher and her radical neoliberal government, Britain was abandoning the norms of the post-war era as it hurtled towards the new millennium. Deller is particularly interested in the relationship between the rise of rave culture and the miners' strikes of 1984 and 85. For Deller, the strikes are the axis of the decade. The social and political events of the early 80s set the stage for the strikes, while the second half of the decade was spent trying to process them. The rise of acid house and the second summer of love are direct consequences of these strikes. Deller's account of acid house takes the form of a lecture given to A-level politics students. His story has a wistful tone, explaining a far-off past that no longer seems possible to a group of young people who seem intrigued, but somewhat confused by it. In his essay Baroque Sunbursts, Mark Fisher writes that rave now seems like a memory bleeding through a mind that is not ours. Of course, rave music never really went away. An unbroken line can be drawn from acid house to today's dominant forms of club music. Deller's film doesn't trace the development of the hardcore continuum, as Fisher calls it, that grew out of rave music and into UK garage, jungle, dubstep, and beyond. Rave parties are still around too. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, underground forms of club music were arguably bigger than ever. There exists a massive global economy centered on club nights and large-scale festivals that look very similar to the raves of the late 80s, and often feature some of the same DJs. What Deller mourns isn't the loss of rave music, nor the physical form of raving. What feels lost is the political potential of rave, the promise of a something else that problematizes Thatcher's famous claim that there's no alternative to her vision of an atomized Britain. Why did this moment pass? What caused the death of rave, or at least the death of rave's revolutionary potential? Deller never reaches a definitive conclusion. At one point, he points to drugs as both the catalyst for rave's revolutionary nature, as well as the seed of its ultimate downfall. Drugs drew the attention of criminal gangs, and as a result, the police, leading to vicious crackdowns that drained the life from the scene. But is that the full story? This video will attempt to uncover why the political possibilities of the second summer of love feel like a distant memory, and what, if anything, could come next. The acid takeover of Britain happened quickly. Although house music had a following in Manchester in the mid-80s, acid house is generally thought to have been brought to Britain through the London club scene. DJs like Paul Oakenfold and Danny Rampling, inspired by their experiences on the Spanish island of Ibiza, opened their own clubs back home in 1987. However, the movement quickly expanded beyond the clubs of London and into the rest of the country. By 1988, club crowds grew in scale from a few hundred ravers to tens of thousands. Throngs of people flocked to far-flung venues to listen to acid house. Raving was no longer exclusive to the in-the-know city crowd. Seemingly overnight, it had become a national phenomenon. Around this time, the media began to pay attention to the blossoming movement. In August 1988, The Sun published its first article about drug-taking at acid house events. Thatcher-aligned tabloid publications began to foment a moral panic, publishing headlines like "Evils of Ecstasy" and "Ban this killer music" that warned of the dangers of acid house parties and agitated for increased police intervention. The police, of course, were happy to oblige. In September 1989, the Police Pay Party Unit was established to coordinate action against acid house parties across Britain. In Everybody in the Place, Jeremy Deller notes similarities in the police tactics employed against acid house ravers and the striking miners earlier in the decade. Most notably, the use of roadblocks to seal off entire cities and restrict the movement of the targeted group. These similarities weren't coincidental. Ken Tappenden, the head of the Pay Party Unit, was one of the key coordinators of police action during the miners' strikes. By 1989, crackdowns on acid house raves pushed the events out of the city and into the British countryside, all connected to London through the newly opened M25 orbital motorway. Ravers descended onto small-town Britain to escape the scrutiny of police, leading to a rash of sensationalist headlines describing ravers terrorizing quiet villages. The moral panic stirred up by the conservative media only served to advertise acid house and legitimize its subcultural authenticity. In her seminal book, Club Cultures, Music, Media, and Subcultural Capital, Sarah Thornton describes how the scare campaign boosted the popularity of acid house, creating a feedback loop in which greater and greater numbers of youth descended on rural Britain as the media detailed their exploits. Eventually, conservative MPs cracked down on ravers with unprecedented force. In July 1990, the Entertainments Act was passed, establishing draconian punishments for unlicensed party organizers, including significant fines and jail sentences. The Pay Party Unit was essentially given a blank check to wage an offensive against ravers. According to Tappenden, within 3 months of the unit's founding, thousands of promoters and partygoers were put under surveillance. Phone calls were tapped, and hundreds of arrests were made. At the unit's height, it employed over 200 intelligence officers throughout Britain. These crackdowns greatly limited the scale and number of raves in England. Sociologist Andrew Hill argues that Acid House died in July of 1990 after the arrest of 836 ravers in Wakefield. To this day, one of the largest mass arrests in British history. Police engaged in a war of attrition. Even if they couldn't shut every party down, they discouraged ravers who eventually became tired of paying for events that might never happen. Promoters became unwilling to bear the ever-increasing risks associated with hosting unlicensed parties, and the Wild West era of acid house raves came to an end. Rave culture returned to the clubs, under the watchful eye of law enforcement units who had been granted considerable new powers to police them with. The culture splintered into various scenes and eventually grew into a massive global enterprise. Thatcher's reign mercifully ended in 1990. She was succeeded by John Major, who largely continued her work, overseeing Britain's entry into the European Union. The creation of a unified single market was the crown jewel of neoliberal policy, and ironically, it supercharged the spread of house music events across the continent. Tony Blair's New Labour was largely content to continue the neoliberalization of Britain, and subsequent attempts to return to Labour's socialist roots have been quashed. The Free Party movement, the successor to Acid House's outlaw element, thrived for a time, but faced even greater crackdown with the passage of the 1994 Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. It was largely policed into submission. Over time, raves became regulated and integrated into the rest of the entertainment industry. By 2016, London had appointed a night mayor, a government official tasked with overseeing the city's nightlife, which was now viewed as a key cultural asset and a critical part of the city's economy. Even the CEO of Goldman Sachs is a tech house DJ. Rave had become accepted, but perhaps stripped of its political potential. Cultural commentators often describe rave as the antithesis of Thatcherism. In his essay, UK Rave Culture and the Thatcherite Hegemony, 1988-94, Henry R.L. John outlines how the cultural analysis of rave stems largely from theoretical frameworks developed by the Birmingham Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies, in particular the works of Stuart Hall and Dick Hebdige. These works draw on the writings of Marx and Gramsci and understand subcultures through their interactions with the dominant culture. Following this line, current commentators often reduce the relationship between rave and Thatcherism as one of simple opposition. To them, raves typify Hakim Bey's concept of a temporary autonomous zone, a space that, at least temporarily, exists outside the grasp of the state. This makes for a tidy narrative. Acid House is a site of resistance against Thatcher's populist authoritarianism, ravers raging against the dying light of post-war Britain until they can any longer. Unfortunately, it's a gross oversimplification. Those who documented the scene contemporaneously regularly pointed out that although rave contradicted key pieces of Thatcherite ideology, in many ways it mirrored it. Sociologist Andrew Hill refers to this phenomenon as a double relationship. The aesthetic of rave stood in opposition to Thatcher's vision of Britain, but it also typified Thatcherite ideals of entrepreneurialism and the individualistic pursuit of pleasure outside the regulation of the state. In his book Generation Ecstasy, music historian Simon Reynolds notes that the people who brought rave out of the clubs and to the masses of Britain were not deeply immersed in the culture of the music. They were largely driven by entrepreneurial desires, and rave was big business. Reynolds writes, "If the summer of love rhetoric ran against the Thatcherite grain, the spirit behind emergent organizations like Sunrise, Energy, World Dance, and Biology was an entrepreneurial audacity utterly in tune with the quick-killing spirit that fueled the economic boom of the late 80s. Tony Colston Hayter and Paul Staines, promoters of the aforementioned Sunrise, are often referenced in discussions about the Thatcherite spirit latent in rave culture. Neither had any background in the music world, but saw the money-making potential that Acid House held. Colston Hayter, the wealthy son of a lawyer, was best known for a video game business he started as a child. Staines was an aide to David Hart, a libertarian radical and close advisor to Thatcher, who played a key role in the breaking of the miners' strike. They hardly typified the bohemian raver ideal, but they were key figures in the history of Acid House. These men saw raves as a test site for their libertarian ideals. They were instrumental in the emergence of the orbital rave, once media and police pressure forced parties out of the city. They exploited legal loopholes that allowed them to evade police shutdowns by claiming that their raves were private parties. Colston Hayter, always happy to promote himself, became something of a media sensation. He took pleasure in pointing out the hypocrisy of Thatcher using the full force of the state to clamp down on a burgeoning new enterprise, despite claiming to be a champion of the free market. After the passage of the 1990 Entertainments Act shut down the Sunrise parties, Colston Hayter and Staines launched the Freedom to Party campaign, a protest movement that failed to gain mass support or make any policy changes, but was highly successful in lining the pair's pockets with income from merchandise sales. It's easy to point to carpetbaggers like Colston Hayter and Staines as examples of Thatcherism in rave culture, but the neoliberal influence went much deeper. An entire alternative economy developed around raves, and it included a lot more than just the drug trade. Record labels, both of the bootleg and legitimate variety, rave clothing companies, and an entire micromedia ecosystem all flourished. The rave scene often embodied Thatcher's enterprise ethos better than her own government did. But it wasn't just the independents who sought a piece of the rave market share. Bigger companies wanted in too. In her groundbreaking essay on rave culture, Living the Dream, Hillegonda Wrightville details the almost instantaneous commoditization of rave aesthetics. By 1989, stores across Britain rolled out rave fashion to the masses, adapting to trend changes with startling speed in order to maintain an appearance of connection to youth culture. High street shops employed teams of youth workers who scoured raves to identify emerging fashions. Brands from a wide range of industries rushed to cash in on the acid house craze. Even banks used rave imagery to reach young audiences. Wrightville writes, "It makes one wonder if a threat was ever present. For most of its lifespan in 1988 to 90, the rave cult was not, as is conventionally thought, a subculture, but rather a form of popular culture that mesmerized, at the same time, style elitists, dropouts, and a great section of the working class youth, as well as the English criminal justice system. As Frederick Jameson put it, local countercultural forms of cultural resistance are all somehow secretly disarmed and absorbed by a system of which they themselves might well be considered a part, since they can achieve no distance from it." Cultural theorist Angela McRobbie identified the commercialization of rave culture as a catalyst for fundamental shifts in popular views about work. Writing in 2001, a decade removed from the end of Thatcher's rule and the second summer of love, she argues that the rise of neoliberal governance led to a widespread individualization of the British people. As the role of the state receded and capital increasingly offloaded responsibilities onto labor, people had to become their own microstructures, shouldering burdens that were once publicly managed. Disembedded from kinship structures and communities, people turned to work as a means of self-actualization and a marker of cultural identity. This shift coincides with a significant growth in the culture industry of Britain, powered by a pool of freelance workers who did not enjoy the labor protections normally offered to standard employees. By promoting the expectation that work should be a reflection of identity and something that is inherently satisfying, capital is able to further exploit workers under the guise of personal freedom. McRobbie writes, "The larger question, of course, is how this fits with the needs of a form of cultural capitalism that is currently reinventing itself as innocuous or soft. For the young woman fashion designer working 18-hour days and doing her own sewing to complete an order, she only has herself to blame if things go wrong. After all, she opted for this kind of unstable career choice. Self-blame, where social structures are increasingly illegible or opaque, serves the interests of the new capitalism well, ensuring the absence of social critique." McRobbie sees rave as the incubator of this new cultural economy. The scale and popularity of rave made it more accessible than its subcultural predecessors like punk, widening its impact on culture at large. The entrepreneurial spirit that underpinned rave's alternative economy provided a blueprint for Britain's creative industry in the 90s. Rather than seek the approval of institutions, artists could just find an empty space, charge friends at the door, and create whatever sort of world they wanted. Rave's blending of leisure and business blurred the lines between work and play. Sociality for new cultural workers turned into a constant state of networking in which individuals jockey to promote their own personal brands. In one sense, these workers are freed from unhappy work, free to choose when and how to make a living. Of course, that freedom came at a price. All risk is transferred from capital to labor, and workers are stripped of their ability to demand better conditions. As McRobbie points out, workplace politics can't exist when there's no workplace. McRobbie writes that in the past she has been critical of those who tried to tie young cultural workers to the project of Thatcherism just because they had entrepreneurial desires. However, now, she writes, the accelerated speed of cultural working marks an intensification of individualization, a more determined looking out for the self. At this point, the possibility of a revived, perhaps reinvented, radical democratic politics that might usefully de-individuate and re-socialize the world of creative work is difficult to envisage. McRobbie saw the culture industry as a test lab for new labor market organizations. 20 years later, it's clear that she was correct. In the UK as well as the US, labor protections have continued to erode. Freelance labor is no longer the realm of cultural workers. The so-called gig economy has created a massive floating labor pool of precarity workers who lack any sort of protections. Individuals are more atomized than ever. Austerity has become the norm, and work seeps into every facet of life. This all paints a bleak picture. Not only does neoliberalism strip rave of its political edge, it co-opts its dynamism and remixes it to further the interests of capital. Rave is also morphed to fit this atomized world. The emergence of live streaming platforms like Boiler Room and the online mix series as a method for musical consumption has de-emphasized the communal experience that typified rave. Even the in-person experiences are mediated through technology. In a memorable moment in Everybody in the Place, a student says that she is taken aback by how carefree the ravers seemed in the footage that Deller has shared. She can't imagine something like this happening in the age of social media. She says that if someone danced in such a carefree manner, others would film and mock them. To her, becoming fully uninhibited seems impossible. The surveillance apparatus of the pay party unit has been internalized. In Baroque Sunbursts, Mark Fisher writes, the lonely connectedness of smartphone addiction is a depressive hedonic reversal of MDMA festivity. Sociality is supervised by multiple embedded corporate platforms. We become our faces, working 24/7 for communicative capitalism. This video has explored how rave became depoliticized, but the question remains, why? No other youth subculture in British history faced anywhere near the backlash that rave did. If Thatcher's breaking of the miners' strike symbolized victory over nationalized industry, organized labor, and the norms of post-war Britain, what did the defeat of rave symbolize? Was Thatcher just making a show of force to hammer home her reputation as the Iron Lady? Or was there something about rave that necessitated such an unprecedented crackdown? Mark Fisher argues that neoliberal interests had to extinguish rave because it symbolized the specter of a world that could be free. Rave was never a coherent political project. Despite being a potential public nuisance, it never posed an explicit threat to the ruling order. What made it revolutionary was that it called into question the capitalist realism that Thatcher had worked so hard to instill. As Fisher points out, capitalism only became dominant through the violent decimation of the leisure culture that people once enjoyed. Rave offered a brief glimpse into pre-capitalist life, as well as a vision of a utopian future enabled by modern technology. As Fisher writes, why should rave ever end? Why should there be any miserable Monday mornings for anyone? At the end of Baroque Sunbursts, which reads much like a precursor to his final unfinished work Acid Communism, Fisher finishes on an optimistic note. He reflects on the Frederick Jameson quote that he derived the title of his essay from. Jameson, from time to time, like a diseased eyeball in which disturbing flashes of light are perceived, or like those Baroque sunbursts in which rays from another world suddenly break in this one, we are reminded that utopia exists, and that other systems, other spaces, are still possible. Fisher writes, this psychedelic imagery seems especially apposite for the energy flash of rave, which now seems like a memory bleeding through from a mind that is not ours. In fact, the memories come from ourselves as we once were, a group consciousness that waits in the virtual future, not only in the actual past. So it is perhaps better to see the other possibilities that these Baroque sunbursts illuminate, not as some distant utopia, but as a carnival that is achingly proximate, a specter haunting even, or especially, the most miserably desocialized spaces. For Fisher, the promise of rave never really died. It was only hidden away. Despite the grotesque commercialization of rave culture, or the psychic privatization of neoliberalism that has made other forms of living seem impossible, the specter of a world that can be free still haunts us. Another world is possible, if we want it.